Yes, we are back. What is happening, Pod Gang? My name is Emil Walker, and you are listening to Inside the Ride, a podcast that dives deep into conversations with fascinating people about the highs and lows of their journey towards purpose. My guest today is Angelique Pouponneau, an environmental lawyer, a legal expert in climate change, oceans and global commons, and the CEO of Seyccat, an organisation based in the Seychelles that was set up to pioneer a groundbreaking $21.6 million debt for nature swap that was completed in 2016 with the support of US environmental organisation, the Nature Conservancy. She grew up in Belle Ombre, one of the fishing districts in the Seychelles, and studied law at university in the UK, acquiring a master's degree in environmental law, specialising in law of sea and natural resources. Since then, she's done work with the United Nations, trained as an environmental negotiator in New York, and co-founded an NGO that is advancing sustainable development through youth-led projects in the Seychelles. I was excited to chat to Angelique about the various projects she's involved with and keen to hear about the steps that are being taken in the battle against climate change from someone who works directly with governments who are able to put new policies in place. There's a few bits of terminology she mentions that you may not be up to speed with, so I'll explain them a little bit more here. Blue economy refers to the exploitation and preservation of marine environment or blue resources. An EEZ, meaning exclusive economic zone, is an area in the ocean where only one country gets to do economic activities such as mining underwater resources or fishing. In the case of islands far from the mainland, the EEZ starts at the coasts of the islands and goes out to 200 nautical miles. El Niño is an irregular occurring series of climatic changes affecting the Pacific region and every few years causes unusually warm, nutrient-poor waters off northern Peru and Ecuador. Some of the effects of El Niño include reversal of wind patterns across the Pacific, drought in Australia, unseasonal heavy rain in South America, and in 1998 it hit the Seychelles hard, bleaching 90% of their coral reefs. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and it has definitely made me feel far more optimistic about the future of our planet. I hope it does the same for you. Please make some noise for Angelique Pouponneau. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's been exciting looking through all the work that you've been doing and all the projects and everything. And so from what I understand, you started working for Seyccat as a CEO this year.
Yes.
How's it been?
It's been a really hectic couple of months. I feel like, I got thrown straight into the deep. Especially I came in February and we had to launch the Blue Grants Fund by April. So a lot of lead up work to get that sorted, but it's been exciting and it's been great looking at new challenges and seeing how to address them.
And Seyccat are the ones behind the debt for conservation, is that right?
Right. So Seyccat is really the trust fund that its existence facilitated the closure of the deal for the Debt for Nature swap. So the Nature Conservancy and the government of Seychelles introduced this concept of this trust fund that would act as more of the intermediary to make sure that everybody is fulfilling its obligation, but as well as the ones that will manage the proceeds coming out from the Debt for Nature swap.
And can you talk a little bit about how it works? Because when I first heard about it online before I came here, I was amazed that essentially they're buying up land to preserve. Am I right? Or ocean?
Yeah. So, so there's a few levels to this Debt for Nature swap. To begin with, Seychelles is a small island developing state. With all small island developing states, we have two major challenges. The first, of course, is climate change, as well as protection of our marine resources. But the second is also external debt. We're very heavily reliant on on importing a lot of goods to satisfy both the local population as well as the tourists that come in. So as a result of that, the Debt for Nature swaps really solves these two big issues. So the Seychelles, through a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, was able to buy back some of its debt from 5 countries at the Paris Club.
Wow.
Right? So the buyback is facilitated through funding from the Nature Conservancy. So that's sort of step one. And then Seyccat essentially holds this money and acts as the intermediary. And what that means is we hold some for grants funding. So that's the grants that we provide for programs and projects. But then we also ensure that our investors are repaid, right? So the government of Seychelles, we're the ones that they make the payment through, and then we make sure the Nature Conservancy is repaid. And of course, the reason that, it is, again, the Seychelles undertaking a loan from the Nature Conservancy, but it's at a low interest rate and over a longer period of time. So that's what makes it a more attractive deal than retaining the debt we had with the Paris Club. But interestingly enough, there are 2 commitments that come with this financial arrangement, and that's where it's critical and why for Seychelles it was almost a no-brainer. So the first environmental obligation within the contract is we had to protect 30% of our exclusive economic zone. So that's 30% of essentially our marine territory, if you like. And then the other aspect is this grant, the money that we got from the discounted buyback, had to be used towards projects and, I suppose, programs towards ocean conservation and climate adaptation. That enables the Seychelles government to essentially say, I am now willing to take this money that is now available to put towards ocean, climate, and the blue economy.
And then there was also some money, about 3 million, that came from blue bonds. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think it needs to be said that the Seychelles, it very recently became a high-income country, right? There are many implications to now having a high-income status, which means there's less access to concessional loans, for example, and less access to it's no longer eligible for ODA, so direct aid. And as a result, it needs to continuously find new ways to access finance. So it's gone the innovative financing or blended capital way, which is really leveraging public finance as well as attracting private finance to it. So the blue bond is essentially that, where through a $15 million investment from private investors, 3 of them.
Just 3 investors, that much money?
Yes.
Wow.
Exactly. It just shows you how much of the financing gap can be filled through private investments. But through the deal, $15 million was introduced. 3 of the $15 million goes towards Seyccat, where we are able to provide grants financing again towards 3 of our strategic objectives. The first is supporting marine protected areas and sustainable use zones. The second is empowering the fisheries sector. And finally, supporting the trialing and nurturing businesses in the blue economy. So that's what the $3 million goes to. But the $12 million goes to the Development Bank of Seychelles, where they're able to provide loans to Seychellois to better enhance sustainable fisheries.
That's amazing. And so it's 210 square kilometers that have been protected. 210,000 square kilometers. Sorry.
Yes, correct. 210,000 square kilometers. And of course, I believe we are now at 26%. So we're on the last 4%, which is very exciting for us. And by 2020, we should have all 30%.
That's amazing.
Designated.
And do you think that this is a model that can be used elsewhere now it's become so successful here?
Yeah, I think, of course, it is a model that can be used elsewhere. It can be replicated as well as it's pretty much scalable. I mean, a lot of people have said the amount of money that Seychelles was able to get out of this debt swap and the blue bonds is quite small. But of course, it makes a huge difference for a small country like ours. But I think there's ability to scale up, especially for bigger countries. So I can say with confidence that Seyccat, for example, through its grants financing, is being able to really invest in Seychelles' future when it comes to the ocean.
And I saw that you'd written a bit of your dissertation on Seyccat, and you mentioned that it's really important to take a more kind of holistic approach to this. What else needs to be factored into this kind of conversation about climate change?
Yeah.
Or ocean climate change, to be specific?
Yes. I think that's something that is critical, taking that holistic approach, because a lot of us, especially when you're working from a country perspective, focuses on your territory, your exclusive economic zone, Everything else is the high seas. It's neither here nor there, sometimes it feels. However, to me, this is the wrong approach. There are three things that I specifically looked at during the past couple of years. The first is land-based source marine pollution. All right, 80%, I believe it is that 80% of the pollution ending up in the ocean is land-based.
80%?
80%. So that means it's coming from the land. It's really coming from the land. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, especially in the Western Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean as a whole, to ensure that these are captured essentially at source, and there are proper waste management infrastructure that is able to ensure that this does not end up in the ocean. So that's the first part. And I mean, I don't know if you've been in Seychelles for a while now. You must have heard about just the sheer amount of marine litter that has been collected over the past couple of months. And Seyccat, in fact, co-financed one of those projects, and they managed to collect 25 tons.
25 tons?
25 tons of waste on one of our most remotest island, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So you can just imagine there's, I think, a population of about 6 people on that island. It's not coming from them.
Yeah.
And they were able to collect 25 tons, and this is coming in from pretty much everywhere. So that's one aspect, that land-based source marine pollution. The second aspect is climate change, right? When it comes to climate change, we all know that the ocean is a carbon sink. The healthier it is, the better resilient it is to the effects and impacts of climate change. And unless we take that holistic approach where we're addressing climate change, just to give you an example, let us say we do protect areas with coral reefs. But if we're protecting it by virtue of saying no activities such as fisheries should take place in that area, but climate is causing, climate change is impacting it in the sense of dissolution of the coral reefs because of acidification of the ocean, bleaching because of the high water temperatures. At the end of the day, our protection would actually not be very effective if we didn't address climate change itself. And then the final one, which is essentially going to that whole concept of borders, is areas beyond national jurisdiction. Unless we take a holistic approach to dealing with our EEZ, as well as the high seas, what you will find is there's no cutoff in the ocean. There's no fence around our EEZ that prevents the harmful practices or harmful activities taking place on the high seas from affecting our EEZ. And therefore, we must take a holistic approach to ensure that all these factors are all in play and our marine protection is effective only if we can also address those other three challenges.
And you grew up here, right? In the fishing district?
Yeah, Belon.
Have you seen, since kind of through your childhood, have you seen the climate change drastically here just kind of in your lifetime?
Yeah. So absolutely. And I always point to the question on temperature. Because I remember growing up as a child, and we used to learn, this was in the textbooks, what was the lowest and highest temperatures in Seychelles, and you'd always say 28 to 30 degrees. You'd always say that. And very recently, we're now talking about 34 degrees. This is in my lifetime. This is me being able to say something that was different in the textbooks that I learned at school in this lifetime. Also, the coral reefs. And this is, I only started really snorkeling and engaging with corals back in 2013. And even in that short span, what once was a rainforest is now a desert.
Just in 6 years.
Just in 6 years. And I mean, to understand the process, we've seen an increase in El Nino years. Every year has just been hotter than the other, and the impacts are clear. And then there's also fisheries. One of the really interesting ones that I wrote my dissertation about as well was the fact that when the waters in Seychelles became very warm around about 1998, this was El Nino. The waters became very warm. Seychelles, as you know, is heavily dependent on the tuna industry. right?
Yeah,
so
there's so many fishing boats here.
Exactly. So we have the largest tuna canning factory in the Indian Ocean.
Wow.
And tuna, however, is a pelagic fish that is dependent on the temperature of water. So when the Seychelles waters became too warm, obviously it has no need to say, I need to be in the Seychelles because the Seychelles have a tuna canning factory. All it does is move. And move to cooler temperate latitudes. And of course, the purseaners, the vessels that fish for tuna, followed them. Port Victoria was no longer the closest port for landing the catch. So other countries like Indonesia, Thailand now became the closest port. And over a few months, we had double-digit percentages of our GDP wiped out. And this is, and I say this to mean in 1998, this was El Nino. And we know El Nino is also a natural phenomenon. But with climate change, it's happening more frequently and more regularly, which I spoke to about after 2015. And I think if this becomes the norm, you're talking about collapsing economies.
Just from the fish?
That's what we're heavily the most dependent on, other than tourism. That's our two pillars of our economy.
So, but you were saying earlier that Seychelles is now regarded as a higher income. High income. Is that from tourism?
Tourism and fisheries.
Tourism and fisheries.
Yeah. Seychelles has now reached, I think it's more than 300,000 tourists coming in every year. We have, of course, very high value tourism as well in the country. Very sophisticated, very luxurious hotel destination. And that has led to an increase in wealth and revenue coming into the country. But all of these are heavily dependent on retaining the beauty of our environment, retaining our beaches, retaining, hotels that are very much on the coastline. So yeah, for me, it is really, yes, we have reached high income status, and that in itself is a question about GDP, right? Because that's what the measurement is based on. And because we have such a small population, it's very easy to get a very high GDP. But what the government of Seychelles has been trying to do is get somewhat of a vulnerability or resilience index that really shows that, yes, we have a high GDP, but the reality is for us to adapt to the effects of climate change, it costs each person more than if you had a population of 1 million. And unless that is taken into consideration, we will have to just deal with the challenges of being a high-income country.
And I was also looking at the kind of human rights stuff that you've been looking into as well, because, I guess climate change wasn't around many years ago, or nearly as much as it is now, so there haven't been laws or international laws put in place. Can you talk a little bit about the work you've been doing to kind of protect these people that will be most affected?
Yeah. So I was doing a fellowship at the United Nations with the Alliance of Small Island States, where I was being trained to be a negotiator on climate change. And my area of focus was loss and damage. And loss and damage, again, really does look at displacement, does look at loss of tradition, loss of culture, if a people was moved tomorrow. And I've predominantly looked at two aspects. The first is during disasters, ensuring that socioeconomic rights are upheld. So one example of that is during the displacement of the people, the Antiguan and Barbudans, and in particular the Barbudans in Antigua and Barbuda after the hurricane. There, you actually need the right policies in place to ensure that socioeconomic rights are not affected. So, for example, policies in the past have been that some kind of payment for you to be taken care of during the time that you're displaced was paid to the head of the house.
And who would pay that?
The government would be paid to the head of the house, and the head of the house was a man, which means that women did not necessarily see this money. And that was problematic. When you're the issue of displacement, if you're kept in almost a camp, is there segregation? Is there access to healthcare? What was found that sexual harassment and rape was frequent in those types of environments. So unless we put in place those types of mechanisms and instruments to protect socioeconomic rights. We're not even talking about political rights here, just social economic rights during disasters that will be critical to an element of dignity for all human beings when it comes to displacement. But then on the other hand, I've worked a lot on looking at displacement, looking at the potential and the possibility of migration when it comes to climate change. And it's a very difficult one, and it raises a lot of questions and a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of questions that people don't want answered. So at the United Nations last year, over 100 countries indicated that they wanted the International Law Commission to look at the legal implications of sea level rise, to move to the active work program. We don't know if that's going to happen yet. I haven't heard back from the ILC, the International Law Commission, but that's what countries wanted. Many countries wanted. Of course, there were those that didn't want that. So the work really goes to what happens, and my one dissertation to begin with was regards to what happens with coastal erosion when we have existing base points. Base points gives us the starting point of our EEZ and then 200 nautical miles out. But what if there's coastal erosion? Does our base point also move inwards? And if it does move inwards...
Such an interesting thought. I'd never considered that.
And if it does move inwards, is there a corresponding inward movement of the outer limits of your EEZ? And if there's a fishing ground where your EEZ used to be and that you no longer have exclusive economic rights over, but is now high seas and anyone can have access to it, does anybody get compensated for that? Especially for a small island that, altogether, all small island developing states contributed 1% towards climate change. So that was one aspect of it, just the loss of marine resources as a result of moving baselines.
So is that a discussion that's ongoing at the moment, or is that something that's being put in place?
At the moment, it is a legal academic discussion. Some countries in the Pacific have indicated and given their political indication that if their base point moves, they will not lose their EEZ. And these are political statements which will inform the development of international law through custom. But there's no treaty about this. The discussion in a formal sense is very scarce. So that was my dissertation. The other aspect is, what is the best and worst case scenario when it comes to displacement by climate? Is it that we all get displaced and given new passports and say, you are no longer a citizen of the Seychelles, you are now a citizen of South Africa? Welcome. Here's the law book. These are the new rules that you need to follow. By the way, we speak English and Afrikaans. I'm not sure what you want to do about Creole. Or is it another scenario where there's the ability to create a sovereign space within another sovereign country, where people are able to retain their culture, retain their language, but will you be able to have almost an existing legal system within another legal system? Because a lot of, and I'll give an easy example which makes a lot of people laugh, but what if polygamy was completely acceptable in that culture? They then move to a culture where polygamy is illegal, bigamy is illegal. What happens then? What if they moved with all 5 wives? What happens then? So these are questions that I've tried to grapple with, and at the moment it's all we really don't know, and it does look like the international community might wait for the fire to be bursting at the doors before we start making a decision about these things.
Seems to be how it goes in history, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I make the statement on the basis that that's how it's always been, and we all know the difficulties and challenges of making decisions like that, especially when you're not sound of mind, thinking through logically and rationally, but rather in emergency and crisis mode. So, yeah, there's a lot of sort of up in the air issues to be thinking about.
And it looks like from kind of I think it's a non-profit that you set up around youth kind of involvement, although young people may not be as well educated as older people on these matters and these issues, why do you want to include them in the conversation so much?
Yeah. Well, I I think in Seychelles it's probably the other way around. I think youth are more educated than the older ones on these issues, mostly because environment education has done just such a good job in Seychelles over the past decade, I could say. And I think young people need to be part of the conversation because we almost act as a moral compass to the whole discussion. I think that young people give that perspective of this is not short term, this is long term, this is about future generations. Let's stop making decisions about just now, but really thinking long term. Because, and I always make this point, in 2050, when the world seems to be going in a very terrible direction, I'll be 60 years old. Which means that I will be a person who is looking towards retirement, and imagine somebody says, Angelique, get on a boat, you need to leave now. Away from the country you've grown up in, away from the people you've known, and you need to just move somewhere else. And I think it's the ability for young people to think so far, because it will be in our lifetime, that adds a whole other element of it. And I think young people also still have the starry-eyed, ambitious, we will solve this approach to climate change and ocean conservation, which is different from the we don't have the resources, we need to be realistic about this, we cannot be too drastic approach of the older generation.
Yeah, I feel like it's these kind of radical can-do approaches that are what's going to get us through everything.
And I think that's all we need to get us through this one.
So I was amazed when I got here to see that they don't have that many plastic bags here. There's a lot of fabric bags. And I was talking to my girlfriend a lot about how crazy it is that somewhere that feels less developed than where we come from can be so much further forward in that sense. And then through looking into the work that you've been doing, you were somebody that was behind getting that off the ground. What did you have to do to be able to pass that with the government and make that kind of a staple thing for shops to be using?
Yeah, it was a really interesting journey because we were a 6-month-old NGO at the time. And we wrote to government and we said, we want to, before we wrote to government, so on the 3rd of July is the day when we talk about anti-plastic bags, anti-single-use plastic bags. And so we said, as an environmental NGO, we would have a day where we educated people about not using plastics and so on. And in Seychelles, we have a terrible habit of celebrating UN days and then not necessarily seeing it through long term. So this was a criticism that got made towards the youth NGO. And they said, oh, are you going to be having this discussion and debate on this one day and then move on with life? So the NGO came together after the success of that one day, which included things like having a person who was about 70 years old who came in and spoke to young people about the fact that plastic bags are not native to Seychelles. This was introduced in the 70s. And how they used to do things and carry fish and do everything without plastic bags before then. These included debates between schools about whether we can have a Seychelles without plastic bags. There was an exhibition in town, and the executive board of the NGO came together and said, we're young people and we're different, right? So we're not going to fall into this one-day event and then forget about this. So we agreed that we would have a plastic bag campaign, an anti-plastic bag campaign. And we wrote to the government indicating that this is what we intended to do. At the time, the government was very much of the view that perhaps we should focus our efforts elsewhere. And still we said, maybe, but we're going to do this anyway. And we had different approaches. The first was through action. So mobilization and action. So we used to have monthly beach cleanups and coastal cleanups where we would mobilize a group of young people on a Saturday and go out and clean. And we had a before and after photo that would be placed on social media to really show that this was not a campaign where young people were just sitting there and asking for things, which is often what governments think of young people. Sort of, they come here, they ask for things, and they expect it. So we said, no, we're going to go out there, we're going to clean, and we're going to show you that we're ready to take action. So in 12 months, we organized 12 cleanups. Some of them pulled as much as 200 people to those cleanups. And in Seychelles, that's a lot in terms of our population size. And so that was one aspect. We also had the aspect of education and research. So we had a team that focused on looking at different policies in the world as to how to bring about this plastic bag change, this ban on single-use plastics, how to bring that about. We also had education where we were going out into the communities, talking about alternatives. But then we started looking at who can we get to buy into this. And we managed to get a lot of private sector individuals to buy into this. So the supermarket here, the Seychelles Trading Company, started having plastic-free Sundays. This was just the beginning, plastic-free Sundays where you had to bring your own bags. We had other shops that were saying, well, we can bring some bags in from another supplier that's reusable. We had shops offering us to use their shop to do adverts so that we could educate more people in the population. So we started to get a lot of buy-in. And I think that's what's critical for government, right? I mean, government, of course, is not necessarily a body that would take drastic change. They'd have to make sure that people are conscious, people are aware, and they want this to happen. So we were essentially getting all the players on board to make it very easy for government to take the decision. But I think there's another element of it which is critical, which was, this was in 2015 and there was an election coming up. So power was really, at this point in time, heavily in the hands of the people. And plastic bag almost became a political discussion. Where, I remember vividly where a minister said, if you vote for us, we'll ban plastics. And again, they made the announcement around 6 months later through our campaign that the intention was there to ban plastic bags. And that they would do it in a phased approach. We were included throughout this process. So even to the point of writing legislation, of helping with that consultative process, to the point of seeing what we would exclude, because there are things that are excluded. You'll see sort of small bags that carry some food products for health and safety reasons. And and then it happened. The announcement was made. And all of this was essentially driven by a youth-led NGO that had a vision and just didn't want to give up on it.
It's incredible. It just feels like it feels so good for the environment, and it feels crazy that everywhere else I go in the world is just using single-use plastics, like they can be recycled or whatever.
And I think Seychelles as well, especially with government, when it comes to making that environmental pitch, like this, and this is good for the environment, it's much easier because we're so dependent on it economically.
Yeah, I feel like because in the UK, I mean, here you can really see the effects of climate change. In the UK, people are there's still a lot of people that don't believe in climate change, which is beyond me. But I wonder, do you think there's plastic bags, there's straws, there's plastic bottles that are kind of in conversation. Do you think there's other things that we can be doing as individuals to try and help this kind of battle against climate change?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. There's so much that we could be doing, and it varies. And I think, yes, the conversation has been on plastic bags, PET bottles, and straws. But I do wonder sometimes, especially because Seychelles is taking a phased approach where this year it'll get rid of plastic straws. I do wonder if at some point we should just have a long list and be like, this is not useful. This is not useful.
Just tick them off.
We have an alternative for this. I'm not sure why this is still here, and just tick them off literally and say one holistic ban on all these products. And yes, you'll get some pushback, but people have adjusted, and people are resilient and they will adjust. And perhaps this is why sometimes in some countries it's more difficult for them to accept the existence of climate change. I've lived in the UK as well as New York, and the US, and the conversation about climate change is a difficult one in countries that have the resources to be resilient against climate change. So when you have the money to address the difficulties that you have, for example, it's getting warmer, oh, let's get an air conditioning. It's getting colder, let's just put in a heater, without thinking of the cost, then I think that helps, that goes a long way to saying, well, we'll be resilient, we'll adapt. But when you're from a country that doesn't have the resources to do that, it's a whole other discussion where you have to sort of face the music because that's a reality.
I know you've got a busy day ahead, so I don't want to take up much more of your time, but I just have one more question for you. What makes you feel most optimistic about kind of reversing the damage we've done so far to the planet?
I'm going to say young people. I've worked with young people now for over maybe about 10 years. And I see their ability to be creative, their ability to think outside the box, their ability to question things that have always been the way. We've met it this way, and a lot of older generations say, well, this is how it's always been. I admire their ability to question that, to ask those difficult questions, and then to also propose alternatives. I admire their resilience. I admire the fact that they won't take this lying down. And it's been very moving for me, working also in a system where it was an old school system. It is an old school system. Working at the United Nations has taught me that there are old school systems in place. But the people I've met there, the young negotiators I've met there, have inspired me to know that there are good people in this old system that are really trying to make a difference. So I'd say the young people, the ones who have sort of the future of the planet at heart, whether it is at grassroots level, whether it is at the international community, I think they're the ones who give me the most hope. But at the same time, I also feel that this move to see more private investors giving money, making an investment towards ocean conservation gives me some hope that private sector will also play its critical role in this, because this is not going to be won by states alone.
Yeah, it's incredible to hear that 3 investors donated. Was it 15 million?
15 million US dollars.
Yeah, we need more people like them in the world.
Well, we say donate. I mean, they made an investment, of course.
But it's still money going into good causes at the end of the day.
Exactly.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And
all right.
I look forward to following your journey and the work that you guys are doing.
Absolutely.
And I'll link all the links to your organisations and stuff as well if people want to check it out.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much again to Angelique for coming on the podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. If you guys want to check out some more of the work that she is involved with, I will link all of the relevant information in the description so you can find that there. If you enjoyed this podcast and fancy subscribing in iTunes, that would be a massive help to us. We'll be back very soon with another podcast, so stay tuned and see you then.